Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 567.5. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy Macpherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I want to take this time here and just say thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I mean, there are so many podcasts out there, and the fact that you are listening to this one, I just really appreciate it. So here we go. Last week, I interviewed an incredible woman by the name of Doreen Hills. Doreen is founder, director for the Center for Healing Trauma and Attachment in Colorado. Just incredible woman. And, you know, when I got off the interview, I mean, she is so inspiring. You feel, I do my interviews over Zoom with video. So I get to watch, you know, and interact with my guests, and you can just feel, and even when you hear the interview, but, you know, seeing her, you feel and see the passion. And that is what drives me to think that there are people out there like her, like you, who are dedicating their lives to helping people who've been impacted by trauma. To me, is so friggin' inspiring. It's what drives me to continue to do this work here. I'm trying to fix my arm here. And I say this because when I first started this podcast, I remember I was sitting in my car commuting back and forth to my internship and later my job. And at the time, I was listening to a lot of different podcasts, really about entrepreneurs who were just doing pretty incredible and inspiring things with their lives. And I was like, you know, and at the same time, I was also thinking about my clients, thinking to myself, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. What am I doing? I'm not cut out for this. And there was a time there when I was also simultaneously going through level 1 and level 2 of sensory motor psychotherapies courses with Janina Fisher. She was the lead teacher. It's incredible. So I would be commuting and thinking to myself, you know, about my clients. Why aren't they listening to me? I'm learning all this trauma stuff. You know, I went into graduate school with the goal of becoming a trauma therapist. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. And I felt like I was learning and trying to help, you know, fix my clients, and so frustrated that I felt that I wasn't doing a good job and they weren't listening to me. And it got to a point where I thought to myself, well, you know, wouldn't it be great if I had, you know, Janina sitting in my passenger seat mentoring me? Wouldn't that be awesome? And wait a minute, what if I started my own podcast? What if I started a podcast to help you know, educate and inspire other just starting out therapists like myself to learn about trauma? What if I brought on, you know, quote unquote master trauma therapists and interviewed them? And I had never done anything like this before. Never interviewed anyone, didn't know anything about podcasts, but I just was thinking in all directions, you know, so inspired by listening to these other podcasts. And that's what I did. And it initially was driven by the podcast, that is, was initially driven by this desire to get information, right? To find out, well, why aren't my clients listening to me? And if they're not, okay, what do I need to learn? What book do I need to learn? And I've talked about this before. When I got into graduate school, it was all about what do I need to learn? What workshop do I need to attend? What book do I need to read? What article do I need to read? What teacher, professor is connected such that they will help me get to the next step, and which was to continually, become the best trauma therapist I could become. And it's very interesting to me because here we are several years later, and I'm not a therapist. I'm no longer a therapist. But what has become my driving force is not so much the accumulation of knowledge, but the honing of the importance of who we are, the importance of cultivating authenticity. And I learned this through the podcast, through the interviews that I was doing on this podcast. One of the questions I would ask of my guests was, can you share an early clinical error, share a mistake, quote unquote, and what you learned from that? And what I thought initially would come up was, well, this intervention went awry. I forgot to use this technique, or, I forgot, page 222 of Bruce Perry's book. But it wasn't that. It was more and more and more of my guests sharing instances of themselves not being present, not being themselves, fearful of being themselves, getting kind of tripped up in weighing the importance of being authentic, or being scared to share who they were. And again, as an important aside here, as I talk about this, I'm not saying knowledge is not important and suggesting that you forget that. That's not it at all. I am saying that is important, but being able to be and who you are, and to uncover that, explore that within the context of working as a trauma therapist is crucial, is vital. And I did not do that. When I got into graduate school, I got in late, or I entered as late. I had to go back. Actually, I got into graduate school at 36, but before that, I was out of school for 18 years, out of college for 18 years. Didn't finish my BA. I went to 1 year at Philadelphia College of Art and then dropped out. And then for the next 18 years, played in bands. I spent a lot of time writing fiction, wrote 2 novels that did not get published. But when I decided to go back to school, I had to get my BA. So I spent 4 years doing that. And then I got into graduate school. So I was 36 at the time. And when I got into graduate school, I, felt, I'd been in therapy for a while and loved it. And I kind of felt like, well, I kind of had this inner work stuff down. I don't really need to work on that. But I do need to get all this information in. And I really was naive at that point. And it wasn't until I started doing the podcast that my eyes opened, and I said to myself, wait a minute, I had not been focusing on this inner work, the importance of being authentic and being myself. I went in, and when I graduated, certainly, and got my first job, I really kind of assumed the role of what I thought a therapist, psychologist should be. It wasn't that I was not being myself, but I definitely was wearing the hat of what I thought a therapist should be. And trying to get all the answers and da 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 da. And it wasn't until, I started interviewing these incredible people on my podcast and started learning from them and hearing of how they valued and how important and vital it was when working with people who've been impacted by trauma to trust oneself, to explore who we are as people, with all the the hills and valleys and the stuff we want to hide and the amazing stuff, but to honor that and to bring that, obviously with ethics and boundaries, to the people you're working with, to bring yourself. And how magical that was. And I'm going to tell you a story here. When I was working in one of my first positions, first jobs, we were assessing and treating young kids who were showing early signs of psychosis. And we had to administer this crazy, 40-page assessment. And I remember one time myself and a colleague of mine were working with this young kid, going through this assessment, and it just was not getting anywhere. The kid was not responding, and you could just feel it was stuck. And what I did was I just took that page, took that assessment, and threw it down on the table, and I said, all right, let's stop this for a second. And I said to this kid, I said, what is it? Help me understand. What is it that your parents out there are not getting, your teachers out there are not getting, the other therapists, the list of therapists that you went to before coming here? What is it that they're not getting, that they're not hearing, that they're not seeing? Help me understand that. And that act of throwing that, assessment down on the table and saying, communicating those words to that kid in that way, opened up the session. And it opened up my understanding of what is needed to, or actually how to communicate with someone, which is just being real. Just being real. I am going to read this quote here from Eugene Gendlin, which, man, it's just incredible to me, and it really is inspiring to me. And he says, the essence of working with another person is to be present as a living being. And that's lucky, because if we had to be smart or good or mature or wise, then we would probably be in trouble. But what matters is not that. What matters is to be a human being with another human being, to recognize the other person as another being in there. Again, that's by Eugene Gendlin. He was a philosopher and therapist and founder of Focusing. But that quote really is what inspires me and drives me. Now, I say this because it is not easy to do this. It's very simple, right? Be yourself, be authentic. We talk about that a lot. But I think there's a chasm in there, and there certainly was for me, because, I grew up as a young kid. I remember there was a couple instances where I got the message that I wasn't smart enough, right? I couldn't go to this school or that school because, well, that's really not, his place. He's not material for this school. And I got that message internalized. I was also bullied as a kid, which completely jacked up my self-esteem for a long time. And to this date, it still impacts me to a certain degree, but not as much though, thankfully. But we each of us, we have our own experiences, right? Our own little trauma, whatever traumas, however you want to call them, that interfere with us being who we are. Now, I'm talking, when you're a therapist working with people who've been impacted by trauma, people talk about, well, the importance of the relationship. Yes. But don't forget, it's very easy to gloss over the complicated meaning of these words, definition of these words. Relationship implies, right, more than one person in a sense, or a relationship between two or more entities. And when you're talking about a client and a therapist, it's two entities. But what has really kind of inspired me is the importance of therapists not just finding themselves and exploring who they are, but owning that, getting to the point where, you're able to walk into a session owning who you are, the imperfect beauty of you, the imperfect beauty of, the fact that, I didn't have all the answers, or, I wasn't the smartest person in the room, or whatever it was, but trusting that what I did have and my ability to just be real and be in the moment and to trust that and to be creative within that context and to be able to stand or sit in that circle that I kind of conceived of it as, when you're working with people who've been impacted by trauma, to be able to be in that circle with them is in and of itself, I think, a privilege. And it's not easy, but to be able to do that and to be present and real and to trust yourself, there's so much magic in that. There's so much healing in that, right? When we're talking to someone, anyone who is in the moment, who is just themselves, you feel it. They exude this humbleness, this confidence, this trust in themselves, in the universe often, that it can be incredible. I mean, it's inspiring, right? You're blown away by it. And, I was interviewing someone a couple of months ago, and she said that ability of the therapist to just be themselves and be real, it is not only impacting and impactful on the relationship, but it allows the client, right, to feel that they are making or having an impact on someone, right? That those clients, those people, that person who maybe has been impacted by trauma, has been affected, victimized by interpersonal trauma, that they, maybe for the first time, can see and feel that they're having an impact on another human being. And man, how powerful that is. How powerful that is. But what is it that is preventing you from showing up as who you are, right? And again, I say this not to suggest that you should walk into any relationship, without ethics and without boundaries, and to just wantonly self-disclose. No. But to be able to trust in who you are, right? What is it that's interfering with that? What is it that's preventing you from doing that? Maybe you feel, oh, I'm just a new therapist, or I don't know enough, or I'm not good enough, or I'm too young, or I'm too old, whatever it is. But to get to that point, I think it does require work and effort and intentionality, right? We call that the inner work of exploring who we are, exploring our boundaries, our biases, our fears, our traumas, working with them. When I started the podcast, I knew that I had been bullied. Like I said, I'd been in therapy for a while, but it wasn't until more and more I started interviewing my guests that I was able to slowly, I think, share more and more about my own trauma experience, my own bully experience and how that impacted me. And there was a lot of shame around it, being a man and having been bullied. And it took me a while to get to this point like now where I'm talking about it and comfortable talking about it. But I believe, that's takes effort for a lot of us. I mean, it certainly did for me. And I want to know, what is it? I want to invite you to think about, what is it that's preventing you from showing up as a real human being, from taking off that, that therapist hat, that social worker hat, that we all wear so well, especially after we graduate, that it almost feels like that hat is like welded to your head. Certainly did me. You wear that around, proverbial hat, with a big smile on your face, and walk into a room with that identity. And I certainly did. I certainly did. And realizing the importance of that quote by Eugene Gendlin I shared before, and the simplicity of that, and at the same time understanding the challenges that can oftentimes bring for a lot of us, because it's not easy to feel that we can show up with our imperfections or show up imperfectly. But I'm saying that is the beauty, that is the foundation of a relationship, to trust in that, right? That's the foundation of the therapeutic relationship and the healing that comes from that. That's what I wanted to say today. I'll close out again by just thanking you for being here, for listening to this podcast. And if you haven't heard, I started a new mini kind of membership called Plus. It's available on, if you're listening on Apple, where I'm releasing podcast episodes that I'm releasing them a couple of months before they actually go on, are released to the general public, and without ads. So you can check that out by going to just Apple iTunes and Apple Podcasts, rather, just the podcasts that say Plus, the episodes that say Plus. You can listen to those, and I think it's about $5 a month. Anyway, it helps support the podcast. But again, thank you so much for being here, and have an awesome holiday. All right, take care.